All right, our Jamie Yuccas has been on the ground following this story from the very beginning, and she joins us now over the telephone. So, Jamie, really fascinating testimony yesterday from the police chief and, of course, from the inspector who provides training. The chief was he sort of laid it out in very clear, precise language what was applicable and what was not applicable. But I just thought that when I saw in your piece there, the inspector, who was sort of more like the way normal people would react, like looking at the video and saying, I have no idea why he's doing this, because that's not what we train.
Yeah, you know what we're going to see over the next few days, potentially, are more investigators talking about that type of thing, that it may have been, and you heard in the chief did say, yes, that conscious and unconscious neck restraints may have been allowed, but there's a lot of caveats to that. And then you have this inspector, as you said, come in and say, I've never seen a modified move like that. And I think what the prosecution is trying to do is they're trying to let the jury know that even if it was acceptable to have a knee on the neck, that the amount of time that Chauvin spent with his knee on George Floyd's neck was not acceptable. That's why you heard so much from the chief, too, early on in testimony about policies, ethics, how this went against that type of thing. And then you have the inspector saying, it's not a move that I teach. It's not a move that we do. So it's just trying to solidify to the jury that this was not acceptable and that it was, in terms of the use of force, not something that was often practiced within the Minneapolis Police Department. We're probably going to hear from more police officers as well, just to testify to that point, to really solidify for the prosecution and the jurors' minds that this is not something that's okay.
Jamie, I know every day we get a pool report from the rotating pool of reporters who are allowed in that courtroom, and I'm always curious to note what they see as far as juror reaction to the testimony that's being laid out. What are you hearing? What are you learning from our colleagues in the press pool about how the jurors reacted to the chief's testimony?
It's a very unique situation, right? Because of COVID, we have one broadcast reporter and one print reporter inside the courtroom. The rest of us are watching from a different media area. And so we do have to rely on these pool reports, as you indicated. And what we were told is that during the police chief's testimony, that jurors were writing a lot of notes. This is a very engaged jury from what we have been told and from what we've seen inside the courtroom. They come in, one of the pool reporters described them as very well dressed and very engaged. They pull out their notepads, they've taken a lot of notes. The thing that's interesting about that, in terms of a legal sense, when I've talked to legal experts here in Minneapolis, if you and I get fired for something that goes against our company policy, we get fired, but it's not necessarily a criminal act. And so when the jurors get this case, the judge is going to have to say that they need to find the burden of proof that this was an illegal act. The chief's testimony talks to the fact that this is something that isn't within policy, and Chauvin was fired, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it was criminal. So the jurors are going to have probably a lot of interesting questions, which is good that they're now taking notes and writing down and seem to be very engaged in what's happening within the trial, because once they go to deliberate, they're going to probably have to rely on a lot of those notes to remind themselves of what was said by whom. Again, the police chief isn't a, quote, expert witness. We're not going to get to those until probably a little bit later this week. And those are people like the medical examiner to talk about the cause of death, and some other, experts who are brought into their field to talk about what could have happened that day to George Floyd in terms of medical conditions. Because remember, the defense is going to have to come back, and their argument is going to be that Derek Chauvin was not the reason that George Floyd died, that it was a combination of drugs and underlying health conditions. The other interesting point when it comes to the jurors that I found is that the police chief, obviously extremely well-spoken, he often would turn and make eye contact with the jurors. So while they were writing notes, he was engaging with them in terms of body language. You could see that he would turn to them, and if there was an explanation or if he felt that there needed to be a follow-up to a defense question, he would often turn towards where the jurors are sitting and make eye contact with some of them. So, we'll have to see if that had an impact on the jurors later or not, but interesting to watch nonetheless.
Yeah, I actually did notice that as well, Jamie. Obviously we can't see the jury when we're watching the video, but I could see the chief occasionally turning to a direction which I assumed was the jury. You mentioned the defense pushing back on the notion that it was, in fact, the knee of Derek Chauvin on George Floyd's neck for 9 minutes and 29 seconds that ultimately resulted in his death. They are seeking to make the case that, in fact, it was, to their understanding, perhaps the drugs that Mr. Floyd may have taken or his health at the time. But let me play a little bit of sound for our viewers who didn't get a chance to watch the full coverage of the trial yesterday from the emergency room doctor who actually pronounced George Floyd dead about a condition called excited delirium, which we've seen come up several times recently in police trials where police have used excessive force on suspects. Let me play a little bit of that.
Certainly there was no report that the patient was ever very sweaty, which is often the case when thinking about excited delirium. There was no report that the patient had ever been, that Mr. Floyd had ever been extremely agitated. So the absence of that information was telling, and that I didn't have any reason to believe that that was the case here.
So as you say, Jamie, Mr. Chauvin's defense team has suggested that George Floyd had some serious underlying medical conditions, that he ingested a high number of opioids. But the doctor there, as our viewers just heard, sort of bolstered the prosecution's case when he said that based on the information he had at the time, he thought that it was oxygen deficiency or asphyxia, which was most likely the cause of George Floyd's death.
Yeah, this is going to be very central to the prosecution's argument that it was, in fact, the knee on George Floyd's neck that caused that asphyxia, right? They want that in the minds of the jurors. They want them to think about that when they start deliberating. And so that's why this witness was very important to the prosecution, because the defense is going to come out and say, well, look at the amount of opioids he had in his system. He had underlying health conditions. And as a matter of fact, the medical examiner even said that there had been hardening of his arteries, that he had what appeared to be a damaged heart. But the medical examiner still ruled it as a homicide. So that's where the prosecution is going to have to bring in people like this doctor to say, no, it wasn't a heart attack. It wasn't that, all of a sudden his heart suddenly stopped and he went into cardiac arrest due to drugs or underlying conditions. It was, as the prosecution laid out in their opening statements, it was one breath at a time that caused the cardiac arrest to happen, which is then why the medical examiner ruled it a homicide. That's what they're going to try to prove. So a very important testimony for the prosecution. I think, the defense did a good job yesterday trying to rebuttal some of that. This doctor didn't have all of the information according to how many drugs were in George Floyd's system, so he really had to push back on that, that the doctor didn't have all the information of what had occurred or what George Floyd's medical history had been. So we have to see how that plays out with the jury, too, moving forward. But this was an extremely important witness to the prosecution. And as I said, we probably will continue to hear from people like this doctor that will help make the case, because the prosecution, it's very interesting. The prosecution is going to have a hard time when the medical examiner comes on. Because the medical examiner found, other contributing factors to this homicide, including underlying health conditions. However, the prosecution's burden of proof is low in this case. They just have to show and prove that Derek Chauvin's knee was just a part of what caused George Floyd to die. So they can say, yes, there were drugs in his system. Yes, he had underlying health conditions. But as you recall, the doctor who treated him at the hospital did not see any evidence of excited delirium, and therefore Derek Chauvin putting his knee on George Floyd's neck was a contributing factor, and he should be found guilty.
It's an important point. We'll see how the jury reacts to that. Jamie Yuccas reporting from Minneapolis for us this morning. As always, Jamie, we thank you.
Thank you.